drink champagne, some die of thirst. No way of knowing which way it's going. Hope for the best, expect the worst. Hope for the best.
Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, October 8th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist and director of domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
Matt's colleague at AEI, our media commentary columnist, Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And our senior editor, Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
So October 7th has come and gone, and as was expected, particularly in the streets of New York City, protesters, not protesters against Hamas and its evil and barbarity, or the Iranian axis of resistance, which yesterday from Yemen fired rockets at Israel that were exploded directly over the nursery school that my grandniece attends in the center of Israel. Just to give you a sense of, what's going on the day that Israelis were commemorating the horrific events of 2023. In New York, actual pro-terrorism protesters by the hundreds marched pretty much from Wall Street or from around City Hall up to Herald Square, which is about 4 miles, and then to Columbus Circle. So it was like a 6 or 7 mile march. It turned violent. Abe, you have a friend who was seen in video.
Yeah, someone I went to school with for years, Todd Richmond, who's a really solid guy. He's co-founder of an organization that's a pro-Israel democratic organization, and he's from what I saw in the video. I haven't spoken to him. Well, from what I saw in the video, he showed up at the protest. I think it was on Fifth Avenue and 42nd or so. That's what it seemed to look like, kind of by our old office. And they were all out there with their flags and their slogans and their keffiyehs. And he took out an Israeli flag, and that was taken from him, and they got in his face, and they were beating tambourines around his head. And then they attacked him with the tambourine, with the flagpoles, and they left him bloody. They took his flag, and it was all caught on camera. And, then I was on a chat with some old friends who, also know him. And they were saying, God, I hope the police get them. And I said, they love getting arrested. They get arrested, then they get released, and then they wear the arrest as a badge of honor, and that's it. But one hopes that assault is a different case.
Yeah, first of all, assault, so that rises to the level of felony. In New York, they release almost all misdemeanor committers are basically released in Manhattan under the auspices of DA Alvin Bragg. But you have two possibilities here with this case, one of which is that it's a felony assault. He was bloodied. He was hit in the head, both by a tambourine and by some kind of a flagpole. And it's a hate crime, which means it can also be elevated to the federal level. And so I don't know that this is going to be as much of a day in the park for the people who assaulted Todd Richmond as other such confrontations that have led to slap on the wrist arrests might be. And remember, as you said, his organization is Democratic Majority for Israel, which I believe was started by the pollster Mark Mellman, and is a organization within the Democratic Party. That's the idea of it, is to have Democrats, meaning presumably Kamala Harris supporters and supporters of other Democrats, who nonetheless want to express support for Israel and make that a signature element of the Democratic Party.
Can I make a point about why these attacks happen and continue to happen?
A moment of revelation happened to me this morning as I'm reading a profile in New York Magazine of Dartmouth president C.N. Bylock. Now, C.N. Bylock, relatively new president of Dartmouth College, I had not heard of her. And it struck me that it was interesting that I had not heard of her since the story of the past year has been these protests turning into harassment and physical intimidation or assault of Jewish and pro-Israel students nationwide. Why haven't I heard of her? Well, as the profile details, President Bylock insisted, as soon as the first encampment sprung up in Dartmouth College, that the campers were arrested and tried and pursued the case until the very end. Guess what happened? No more encampments in Dartmouth College. And so I think we have to recognize that these attacks, they occur in a context of juridical authority and disciplinary action. If you immediately release these protesters on misdemeanor charges, as you suggest, Abe, they're going to do it again. And if you don't pursue the assault criminals, the criminals who commit assault, to the very end, they're going to do it again. So it's no accident, as our Marxist friends would say, that these worst protests are happening in New York City, because New York City has a culture of lawlessness that has sprung up over the past several years.
Well, I've told this story before on the podcast, but in 1970, I believe it was 1970, Edward Levy was the president of the University of Chicago. And the administration building was occupied, as often happened in the 1960s. And what was different about Edward Levy's tenure as president of the University of Chicago, as opposed to the tenure of Grayson Kirk at Columbia and King? Trying to remember the guy's name. Brewster Kingman. Brewster, whatever.
Hale?
Maybe the other way around.
Yeah, Kingman Brewster.
It's a very Yale name.
Yeah, whoever it was at Cornell. Levy had 150 people arrested, and they were expelled. And I got to the University of Chicago 8 years later, and the school was politically quiescent. So much so that there was a protest my freshman year against a speech that was to be delivered by Robert McNamara, who had been the Secretary of Defense during the Johnson administration. And, desperately, the young Spartacists and others tried to gin up a protest at Chicago, and there were a couple hundred people on the quad with signs and things like that. But there was no heart in it. There was no soul in it. Couldn't get it going. Levy had established, even though we had no experience of it, because we were 18, 19 years old, and this had all happened when we were 8 or 9. But the mood, the spirit, the overall ethos of the campus was this had been established as a place for learning and not a place for activism. And it got into it was either in the DNA of the school in general, which is what allowed Levy to be the tough guy that he was, or, it was like epigenetics, and that he kind of folded it into the genetic structure of Chicago at a critical moment, and Chicago went on, and I believe has remained, even though it had a not great spring within campus itself, a relatively politically quiet place. So that speaks to the Dartmouth experience and to other such experiences. I've also told this story, and then I'll move on. We all know your colleague Fred Kagan at AI, his brother Bob Kagan, the historian and author. Their dad, Don Kagan, was a professor at Cornell during the uprisings in 1968 at Cornell, and Alan Bloom, who was also there at the time. and was a professor, told me this story when I was a student of his at Chicago, that there was a meeting of faculty who did not like protests and were disgusted by the radical takeover of the campus and all of this. And they were standing around and saying, maybe we should issue a statement, maybe somebody should come out and we could write a letter to the New York Times. What should we do? And they were all sort of standing around. And Fred Kagan's and Bob Kagan's mother, Myrna, who was a housewife, who was not any part of the campus life, but her husband was a professor of history, of a classicist, said, "I just want to know one thing," she said in her Brooklyn accent. She said, "Where are the men? Where are the men in this room? Are there any men in this room?" I just think that is the greatest story of the 1960s.
I think we need it. I think we need swag that's like hashtag Team Myrna, because that is actually a question for today, not just from the 1960s. And to Matt's point, the other thing we should notice, and again, I think we've become almost immune to this because we see it happen so often. This was, after the Columbia invasion of a building in Columbia and the hassling and basically kidnapping of a janitor there by some of these protesters. They are all masked. Look at the street scenes from yesterday. All the protesters are covering their identities. I am a big fan of the right to protest. I think everyone should get out on the street. I don't like joining protests, but everyone has a right to do it. Look, the March for Life comes to Washington, D.C. every year. Thousands and thousands of people who do not support abortion and are there to protest abortion laws. It is always peaceful. They do not cover their faces. There are plenty of ways to protest what's going on in your country without covering your face and beating people up on the street. These are not protesters. We should stop calling them that.
Right, exactly.
They're roving gangs of bullies and assaulters, and they should be prosecuted as such. Sorry, I'm getting wound up because that video
they're political hooligans. They are political hooligans.
Exactly.
They are thugs.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that. They're anti-Semitic pro-jihadists. I mean, this is the longer this goes on, the less it looks like anything that happened in the 60s, I think. It's we were a little surprised last school year when they were the protesters, the pro-terrorists, I don't know what to call them, the terrorist supporters were so naked about it, about their support for terrorism and jihad. But now it's just endured. I mean, it's at every single one of their events, they have the flags out of various terrorist groups. They're chanting various terrorist slogans. They're saying anti-Semitic things. This is nothing like a protest, and it's very dissimilar, I think, to a lot of what happened in the 60s. I just want to say on the point of where are the men, say Todd Richmond acted like a real man. He was there alone. He didn't back down as much as they got into his face, and he really showed no fear. Right up until they bloodied him.
Can we talk about how the president and the vice president and the challenger for president all marked the occasion?
We must.
Can I just say something about Richmond first quickly before we move off the topic? I find it telling of the times that his organization feels the need to exist at all. The Democratic Majority for Israel. Throughout modern American history, there was no such need for a pro-Israel Democratic Party organization, and there is now, and he's the insurgent who gets bloodied on the street.
Yeah, like it would be called, humans for oxygen. Like that was the default position of the Democratic Party for 50 or 60. A lot of us think that, the Democratic Party has had within its ranks since the late 60s, early 70s, this radical rump that is anti-Israel that they had to deal with. Jesse Jackson, leading it, in the early 1980s and others, but it was still the default position really pretty much until 2012 and the famous moment at the convention in 2012 when the voice vote to have Jerusalem called the capital of Israel in the Democratic platform was voted down from the floor by voice vote, and the voice vote was somehow mysteriously too quiet for the chairman of the convention at the time, Mayor Antonio Villagrosa of Los Angeles, to hear. And so Jerusalem was in fact entered into as the capital of Israel in the Democratic Party platform. But that was the moment at which it really broke out, right? It broke out as a totally public matter. But yes, let us move on to the president, the vice president, and Donald Trump. I just want to say, Seth, there were two very peculiar moments of what I would call Jewish illiteracy, one on the part of Biden and one on the part of Harris, in an effort to commune and be in solidarity with the Jewish people, that showed that the ability to fact check or to have proper sensitivity or something is really getting worse and worse, not just, at news organizations, but everywhere. So Biden lit a Yortzeit candle, that is a memorial candle that burns for 24 hours, that you light on usually on the anniversary of the death of a family member, of an immediate family member, or on certain moments in the year, particularly Yom Kippur, when you are memorializing the dead. It's a weird thing for Biden to have lit a Yortzeit candle, because it's not exactly offensive, I guess, but it's not his family, it's not his people. And then the rabbi of Adas Israel, the largest conservative congregation in the United States, said a prayer that really is not appropriate to have been said on the day that the prayer was said. That was one. And then the second was that Kamala Harris planted a pomegranate tree at the Naval Observatory, where the house of the vice president is, saying that the pomegranate is an enduring Jewish symbol of hope and righteousness. And no, it isn't. I have been asking people who are far more literate than I about this. There is a kind of cute kids myth that is told to kids that we eat pomegranates in the fall because there are 613 seeds in a pomegranate, and that corresponds to the 613 mitzvot in the Torah. But that's a story. That's like first of all, there aren't 613 seeds in a pomegranate, and second of all, that's just sort of like something to say. People could go, "Oh, isn't that cute?" And God's will is everywhere. There is no tradition in which the pomegranate tree is a Jewish thing of righteousness. So whoever was writing the speech, somebody said, "Oh, I remember from like when I was at summer camp, somebody said the pomegranate and Jews in the pomegranate." Seth, does that correspond? You are a more religious person than I, and a more learned person than I. Does that correspond to your understanding?
I will say that it's my kids love this time of year because they strip the pomegranates of the seeds and put them in the bowl, getting ready for the meals, and eat half of them before we even get to the meal. So the funny thing about the pomegranate stuff is that the pomegranate is the Rosh Hashanah. The Jewish New Year, we have actually a whole, what you would call a Seder, which is an order of events, a process, an order of blessings and things. Everybody does it the first night. I think most people probably do it the second night, but that's up to them. Of where we have symbolic foods, symbolic fruits called simanim, which means signs, symbols, and after each one, you say a special prayer. And I just want to mention a couple of the special prayers that are said. After beets, you eat beets. The translation is, "May it be your will, etc., that our adversaries be removed." If you eat a leek or carrot or cabbage, may it be your will, etc., that our enemies be destroyed. If you eat a date, by the way, you eat all these things, may it be your will, our adversaries be consumed. Another one is that we be fruitful and multiply, like pomegranate does that too. So there's a whole bunch of these that are like, may we be fruitful and multiply and have a sweet new year. But 80% of the prayers that we say before we eat, we sit down at the beginning, 80% of the prayers. And my kids joked about this because they said, didn't we just say that our enemies should be consumed and torn asunder and all that stuff? I said, yeah, but we said it in a different order, because when you say it after eating the gourd, you say it you say the words in a slightly different order, and it means that they should be torn asunder for their evil plans and things like that. So I just want to say, we just got through a holiday where we sat there and we said over and over again, may our enemies be defeated, destroyed, torn asunder. It is not it's not an after school special.
Well, I'm sure Doug Emhoff recites the prayer after the gourd.
Yes,
at their Sunday brisket dinner, Seth. So.
Yeah, that is very important. And one other point to be made here is that Kamala Harris said, "May their memory be for a blessing," which is what you say. Zichrono Levracha. You say that at a house of mourning, or you say it to a mourner, or you say it about mourning. That's as a result of a natural death.
I just want to make the point about how the politicians dealt with.
But can I just finish this one point?
I'm sorry. I didn't know you were continuing the point.
No, but this is the point. Because Mayor Soloveitchik wrote about this for us at the time of the Tree of Life massacre for commentary. So for a murder, when there is a murder, you do not say, "May their memory be for a blessing." That is not the phrase that you use. You say, "May God avenge their dead." May God avenge the blood. Excuse me. May God avenge their blood. It is not an after-school special. It is not Judaism as bagels and lox and tikkun olam and let's all heal. It is, there are things that are so unspeakable. Hashem yikom damam. May God avenge their blood. It is not enough to say, man, so sad.
Right.
Bring them home.
You do not say the prayer for a ceasefire over the pomegranate.
Exactly. Okay. I'm sorry, Matt. I interrupted you.
I know. I think
and hijacked your point. So please go ahead.
I broke out my Talmud while you guys were talking. I'm taking notes. I'm sure there's a midrash about what you're saying. The prayer after the beat. I'm going to look it up after this podcast.
There are 5,000 years.
No, it wasn't. Yeah.
Midrashim.
Okay. So just to kind of take it back to kind of American politics for a second. What you're saying is absolutely true, because I thought that the occasion really illustrated the divide between the two parties here. Think about it. So Biden and Harris had separate events, but both were events of mourning and remembrance. And they were somber and small. So Biden, as you said, had Dr. Jill on one side and the rabbi on the other. That was it. They were looking over a table, one candle. Harris just had the second gentleman, and they were outside, and the wind was kind of gusting, and there was a lot of sirens in the background, and it was just kind of an odd atmosphere for the event. What did Trump and Vance do? Well, I'll start with Vance. Vance went to a Philos Project rally. So you had mourning, remembrance, and resolution, talking about how October 7th was an attack on America just as much as Israel, about how Israel is a good guy and Israel needs to be allowed to defeat the bad guys, so, similar to what he said during the debate. And then what did Trump do? Well, Trump went to the tomb of Menachem Schneerson, the Lubavitcher rabbi, in this amazing kind of communal event, and he put the blessing in for the release of the captives. And it was kind of, as many of these Hasidic events can seem, almost a carnival-like atmosphere with all the different people and all the different ways of dress and prayer. And I just thought the contrast was so amazing. And you had on one hand somber, trauma, sadness, and on the other, yes, so mourning, thinking about what happened a year ago, but also a kind of determination and a sign and display of solidarity with Israel in this moment of peril now.
Trump had a family of a hostage there as well, if I recall.
Right. Yes. And Ben Shapiro.
Yes.
And Ben Shapiro. Yes. Now, here's the other thing. Been very critical of Vance. Everybody knows, listening to this podcast, I've been very critical of Vance. Vance said something yesterday that was very crystallizing for me, which seems very surprising, given how much we have talked and thought and gone through this. And he said, bring them home is the wrong message. Or he didn't quite say it was the wrong message. He said, I think we need to say something else, which is let them go. Now let's think about, this is a brilliant thing that he said, or somebody thought to tell him, or I don't know what, but he said it. Bring them home places the agency and the responsibility on the release of the hostages on Israel. It is the job of Israel to bring them home. And it may well be, that is a ransoming of the captives, and the dealing with captives is a part of a millennia-old Jewish tradition. Bring them home. But of course, Israel is not to blame for the fact that its people and some Thai workers were taken and are in the tunnels. Israel is not to blame. They're holding them. Let them go. You monsters, let them go. You unspeakable villains, let them go. And the bring them home thing became a convenient truncheon inside Israel for the domestic political fight against Benjamin Netanyahu over the past year. Because if the job is to bring them home, then of course that has all sorts of follow-on ideas, like have a ceasefire when you're on the march, because maybe that's when you can bring them home, which in fact did happen in the only pause in the war in late November of last year, when 80 hostages were released, because Hamas had been battered so into such incredible stunnedness that they needed to catch their breath. And so this deal was struck that they then violated after 7 days, when it could have continued to go on, and the war resumed. So I am grateful to Vance.
It's such a brilliant formulation that I wish someone came up with it a year ago.
I know,
actually, and to counter this.
Well, I think, and I've been hearing this from listeners of the podcast recently, I think the bring them home formulation is just beginning to hit some people as conceptually flawed. Like, it took some time, right? And now I think what Vance did was recognize that and realize that it needs to be flipped to let them go. And what's remarkable is that the shift in agency is interesting, because now it's on Hamas and the decisions for Hamas, whereas for most of this administration, it's like America has no agency. All America can do is make concessions or try to, guys, let's simmer down a little bit here. We can't escalate. And what's happened, that's given the enemy all of the agency.
Right.
So in this kind of rhetorical jujitsu now, it's like, no, it is
agency.
You do have agency, but we also have agency in calling you on it. And if you don't let them go, we're going to punish you.
And Matt is right, because we could just take the case of somebody who was profiled in the Times of Israel a week ago, the owner of several restaurants named James Oppenheim. They profiled this guy who runs a kosher bacon cheeseburger place in Tel Aviv, which there is such thing, as long as but he said, so they started giving there was nobody coming, so they started giving them away as comfort food to people. And then it says this, exactly what Matt just said. It took several weeks for Oppenheim, a tech entrepreneur and restaurateur who has worked in marketing for most of his career, to notice the black, red, and white bring them home now messaging hastily put together by the Hostages and Missing Families Forum in the first days after the massive terrorist attack. When he finally did pay attention, it didn't make sense to him. Quote, "Who are we yelling at? said Oppenheim. Why on earth are they fixated only on the Israeli government? You don't hear a peep about Hamas. So that is exactly what Matt just said, which is that people didn't think about it. It didn't start as an attempt to attack the government.
It's a soundbite phrase, right? Bring them home. It's from Les Miserables. It's from the musical of Les Miserables. It's the big song at the end that Jean Valjean sings, Bring Him Home.
I have to go back because
that's where it came from.
But wait,
which is also kitschy.
It's a leftover politically when Boko Haram kidnapped.
Yes, the Bring Our Girls Home, exactly.
Yeah, Bring Our Girls Home. Hundreds of Nigerian girls. There was a hashtag Bring Our Girls Home thing that Michelle Obama was jumped on. Everyone, and by the way, even that makes no sense. Who you're talking
and
to?
Did
Boko
it work?
Haram?
It didn't work.
Yeah. So I think it was out there.
Bring back our girls.
Bring back our girls. Right.
Yeah. Now I need to say something about Trump at the Ohel. That is the grave of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's 30 years gone now. Trump is now the only person on the face of this earth who has both touched the tomb of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and grasped the magic orb of Saudi Arabia. Everybody remember the glowing magic orb in Saudi Arabia?
Because Trump brings people together, John.
It's like the moment.
When is he going to bring Mohammed bin Salman to the Ohel?
No, it's like either that or he's going to end up finding the Holy Grail, or he's going to touch the wood, the last wooden piece of the cross.
It's much more mundane. He's the king of cameos. Remember, he popped up in every 80s movie he could possibly muscle his way on set for. It's part of it's a political cameo.
By the way, what the third one is he's going to try to go up to Haram al-Sharif.
Well,
and then they're going to have some trouble.
How that will work. Yeah,
I don't know that. Yeah, but I have to say again, not a fan of Trump. There was a gravity in the image of him next to Schneerson's tombstone, and by the way, that's a controversial. The Ohel is a place of some controversy among Jews because there is this the Lubavitcher Rebbe occupies a mystical status that is slightly troubling to many of us because he seems to be worshipped. There was an idea that he might return from the grave, which seemed Christological and therefore a violation of sort of fundamental Jewish doctrine. That was in the early years after he passed. People go to the grave of the Rebbe to pray and to ask for his intercession in cases of family despair or whatever. I know a family who had a child born with severe defects. And one of the first things they did the week that the child was born was to go and pray at the grave, seeking miraculous intervention. These are problematic ideas in Judaism that we don't have to go into great depth. Nonetheless, I don't know that he could have picked a more interesting or salient place to do this. And we have to, I think, if we want to thank Ben Shapiro probably for being the author of this idea, and certainly or a facilitator.
Well,
of this
Ambassador
idea.
Friedman was there as well.
David Friedman, right? And so because what for believing Jews, and that is Trump's base among Jewish voters, right? We have been led to believe that he will have an overwhelmingly positive turnout among Jewish voters of belief, and particularly the more fundamentalist the belief, let's say, the more it is likely that such a voter will turn out for Trump. But he chose a place of great gravity, and there aren't that many in the United States that are religious in nature. You know, you go to the Holocaust Museum or any Holocaust site. You can go to a synagogue, but of course there are thousands of synagogues and they're not particularly holy. And so he was sending a message to Jews of belief that whatever you hear about him, and he had dinner with Nick Fuentes, and he said nice things in the wrong way about Charlottesville and all of that, that if you want somebody who has your back, this is the guy who has your back.
And he's seized on Iran. He is drawing the contrast between his approach to Iran and his approach to what Israel should do in retaliation for the ballistic missile attack last week, and what Biden is saying. Trump and Vance are united in messaging that Israel should do what it needs to do and should consider taking out nuclear facilities, should consider taking out energy infrastructure, should consider taking out command and control. Whereas Biden, in a series of statements last week, said Israel should not touch the nuclear program, should not touch the oil infrastructure, and shouldn't even touch the refineries or the storage facilities for the oil. Trump is saying Israel must defend itself and should be allowed to. Biden is trying to restrain Israel in the last month before an election. And that also leads to what messages the two campaigns are saying to different constituencies. You mentioned how Trump going to the OHEL is another example of his outreach among Orthodox Jewry, Hasidic Jewry. What is Harris doing? Harris can't say to 60 Minutes that Benjamin Netanyahu is an ally of the United States. The Biden-Harris administration makes a show of releasing more than $100 million in aid to Lebanon.
$157 million.
$157 million in aid to Lebanon.
For the suffering children of Lebanon.
The children of Lebanon. Okay. At the same time, they're saying that FEMA is apparently out of money to deal with the devastation of Hurricane Helene and the oncoming devastation
of Milton.
Milton, thank you. Hurricane Milton headed toward Florida. And what's the background of that? Well, it seems, based on the reporting and based on the polling, that Harris's campaign in Michigan is in big trouble. And so we could, at the very least, we can say that Trump's outreach is working among the Orthodox Jewry. And Harris's attempts to placate Muslim voters and Palestinian voters in Michigan is not working.
She's trailing Tammy Baldwin, but you know where she is going?
That's Wisconsin, yeah.
Or sorry, Tammy Baldwin, Wisconsin. But she's also, the blue wall is crumbling, right? That's the concern about the internal polls for her. But you know what she is doing that Trump, I think, has given up and probably is tactically wise to do so? She's going on Call Your Daddy podcast. She's talking to women voters who still haven't quite made up their minds, not the pro-Harris, I will vote on reproductive rights till the day I die type of voter. But she is talking to those women, suburban women. She's again trying to reintroduce herself. But the 60 minutes, she's also in a situation where, we've talked about this before, she wants to maintain this gravitas because she's been vice president, forgetting, of course, that only two vice presidents, correct me if I'm wrong, since World War II have succeeded in one. It's Truman and George H.W. Bush, and neither one got a second term. Like, she's actually in a position that's not favorable if you look at history.
Well, I mean, even Truman inherited the office.
Right, so. Exactly.
No, but
she really sort of did too.
She effectively kind of inherited the office,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. But she is reaching out, and I watched the, you watch the Call Your Daddy podcast, you watch some of these interviews, you're like, this is just ridiculously lacking in substance. But the messaging she's doing there is going to be somewhat effective. I don't think it'll outweigh the blue wall, the working class voters those white men she needs, but she is actually, there's a strategy there.
What's interesting about the change in the United States and the alignments in the United States is that until 60 years ago, the idea that if you did outreach to Orthodox Jews, that might be problematic for you with people of other faiths. Catholics might not like that. If you did some kind of big, if you went with Billy Graham, if you went to a Billy Graham rally in the 1950s, that might upset urban Catholics who don't like evangelical Christians. Evangelical Christians still had bad attitudes toward Orthodox Catholics, and the like. Now in 2024, I think it is very clear to people of faith that if you align with a person of faith, even though that person does not follow your specific doctrine, the politician who is doing that is a person who is sympathetic to people of faith, generally speaking. Now, Jews, of course, occupy an interesting place here because evangelical Christians have this their own reasons for supporting Israel that aren't, that are faith-based but not Jewishly faith-based. But I think that Trump, as is often the case, though maybe not consciously, is establishing a set of guidelines for the people who are supporters of his, which is if I'm gonna stand here with these very religious Jews, you know how I feel about you if you're a weekly churchgoer.
But that's also a fact based on our rapidly secularizing society, generally,
exactly.
right? Because we have a Catholic president who supports late-term abortion. So some of these religious signals no longer apply.
Right. But as I say, I think it's people who of belief for whom their belief plays a daily role in their lives that I'm talking about. And then you have the nuns, right? The people of no faith, no religion, and then you have this kind of other world. And so I think Trump's outreach. You
have the other nuns who are definitely not of no religion.
Right. Yes. But you don't have many of those anymore.
Harris is actively, actually the Harris campaign is actively courting one faith, Muslims, in particular places where she needs their vote. Otherwise, she doesn't really talk much about faith.
She met with leaders of the community last weekend.
Right.
Philip Gordon, her national security advisor, met separately. You're absolutely right. And so let's talk a second about why the Democrats are worried about those blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. We know Pennsylvania is tied. I mean, that's apparent in the public polling. What we're seeing in Michigan is that the public polling is getting closer and the private polling is worrisome. And in Wisconsin, we've had some weird polls that show that Eric Hovde, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, so that's what I'm going to go with, the challenger of incumbent Tammy Baldwin. Yeah, right. Is making headway. And that might suggest that Trump is pulling close too. So why is that happening? Well, I'll give you one answer. 60 Minutes. Okay. Anyone who watches Kamala Harris on 60 Minutes cannot help coming away from that experience with grave doubts about her ability to be the president of the United States of America. And so, go on the Call Your Daddy podcast and probably communicate to people who are already in your camp. I mean, I don't know how many undecided suburban moms are regular Call Your Daddy listeners.
Yeah.
It's a big audience for sure, but I have a feeling it kind of trends more youthful and more pro-Democrat, pro-abortion right. 60 Minutes is the most popular broadcast program in America. That's not the NFL. And so a lot of Americans watched her on 60 Minutes. And I refuse to acknowledge the possibility that they would come away from that interview and say, yes, she's up to the job.
Well, she also, remember she had a weird teleprompter freeze last week that the media totally buried. But I think it would have been better for her, given her performance on 60 Minutes, to have noted that. Like, she completely froze and started giggling maniacally and saying 32 days and glaring at whoever was off to the side of the stage who'd let her teleprompter run out. She couldn't riff during giving her stump speech. She couldn't riff for 2 minutes without a teleprompter. And I think we saw that when she was pushed with some of these questions, particularly about the border. She cannot answer. She cannot give a direct answer.
The thing about we can get into the details of the 60 Minutes interview because it was extraordinary, but just in a general way, to Matt's point about people coming away from it thinking anything other than she's not ready to be president. America has seen the Joe Biden presidency, and they've seen Joe Biden, and they've seen him as president, knowing or sensing at least, and then knowing that he can't, he's still president, really be president. Yet here we are, the machinery of government turns on, and there's a man in the Oval Office who's not all there. That lowers expectations dramatically.
Well, but Abe, he was forced out of the race because of his infirmity, and he was not in the current condition in 2020, right? And he was also helped by the pandemic, which kind of forced him to be in the basement. This is Harris running for president in a very short window, and she has been hiding for much of the campaign so far, and now she realizes that's not working, so she's trying to come out of hiding, and her first major interview with the most important news program in the United States is a total flop. I mean, it's a train wreck.
Well, and this is where let me just say one thing, because I think I'm thinking about what Matt said about the Call Your Daddy podcast, and he's right, because I think this is part of her strategy, right? She's evasive when she's hit with the tough issues on a program like 60 Minutes, and she's light and personality based when she's on these and that combination actually might lead to more doubt rather than like reassuring even her base.
But I mean, I hesitate to say that when she goes on Call Your Daddy, or when she goes on The View later today, or when she is with and when she is with Howard Stern later today, she's not light. Like, she is still as guarded and uncomfortable, but in a different way. She's
allowed to say her talking points, right? The problem is the second you say, "Can we move off the talking points?" She has nothing to say, and she gets angry at you. So the favorable media outlets allow her to just stick to the talking points, so it's all vibes.
No, fair enough. But I'm just saying, having watched what I watched of the Call Your Daddy event and some others, it's not as though she does, like the revolutionary thing that George W. Bush did when he went on The View 25 years ago or something, and seemed very relaxed. And like a personable, like he was, maybe it was an act, it doesn't matter, but it was a significant political moment, because he was not the person that he seemed, the awkward, uncomfortable, inarticulate person that he seemed to be on the campaign trail. I don't see that she's all that much different. I mean, she smiles more and she cackles more.
Well, she's carried by the co-host, because what she's doing is she's going on shows, not just interviews. These are entertainment shows. There are 4 hosts on The View who are practiced at running a show, trying to be funny, getting the crowd to whoop at the right times, and all these other things. She's going on a show and not just an interview. And so she doesn't have to be light there either, because she's not the comic relief. She's not the one who has to, she just gets carried by the people who know how to run a
she
presentation.
Doesn't come across, but she doesn't come across all that great on them either. But let us talk about 60 Minutes, because this was a policy interview with Bill Whitaker, who was sober and calm, and was determined to ask her substantive questions and to put her in a position where she had to answer those questions without ever going anywhere that was not entirely respectful. So when he asked her about the border, this is what she said, quote, "The policies that we have been proposing are about fixing a problem, not promoting a problem, okay? And the numbers today, because of what we have done, we have to cut the flow of illegal immigration by half. We have fentanyl by half, but we need Congress to be able to actually act to fix the problem." That is a direct quote. So if I read it again, if you saw what I was seeing, it's not a word salad. That is, people say that she is a word salad. It's Mad Libs.
It's evasion.
It's like a series. No, it's a series of like political cliches and phrases that she is putting in with the, where it says adjective here in a Mad Lib, or noun or verb or food or something like that. She does this where she just takes these prefab phrases and places them in order like an AI, but they don't make sense as a whole. So is she saying that they fixed the problem, they reduced fentanyl by half, or they have to reduce fentanyl by half? Or that what they're trying to do is to try to fix a problem, not promote a problem?
I was
Who
thinking
wants
about this.
to promote a problem?
The AI would do better. If you fed Bill Whitaker's questions into the AI bot and said, how should a Democratic presidential candidate answer them? The AI would be much better. So she's actually worse than the AI candidate, which she has been compared to. And what she's trying to do in that answer, it's clear, is evade any responsibility for the last 3.5 years. Because the question was, Madam Vice President, was it a mistake to reverse all the policies at the outset of the administration that led to this unprecedented numbers of illegal border crossings? And she refused to answer the question. She would not admit that those policies were a mistake. And so she went to this talking point that, well, since we did the executive order, which for years we said we could not do, there has been a decline. There are other ways in which those numbers have declined. There are more immigrants seeking asylum through government-approved means now. But the attempt to evade the record is what's so striking. And then the other half of the interview, the question where Whitaker said, how are you going to pay for all this? The housing plan, the huge increase in the child tax credit, the small business giveaways. She had no answer except to say the people, the wealthy people who can afford it. I like that, because so basically, if you're, I guess, a millionaire, all you need to do is say, "I'm sorry, I can't afford the tax increase. I can't. Times are tough. I can't afford." But those who can't afford it, she said, they're going to have to pay their fair share.
But Whitaker said. So Whitaker then said, "But let's be in the real world.
Yeah.
How are you going to get this through Congress?" And then she said, privately,
right,
many members of Congress have told me that they understand that their constituents want this.
Okay,
well, if their constituents want it, they're not going to be saying it privately off the record.
But this is where I do want to push back a little bit on this idea that these soft shows she's going on, including The View today and Call Your Daddy, she actually does see those as making policy remarks. She talked a lot about abortion on Call Your Daddy. She's going to propose a new plan to give more money to people who care for aging relatives on The View. Those are like, I mean, we think of those as kind of soft policy. Like I'm more worried about the border and, our foreign policy personally, even though I happen to be female. But those are soft policy proposals, and the follow-up isn't there, right? So if she was asked those same questions about how you're going to pay for people who are caring for aging relatives, she's not going to have an answer either. But she comes across, and this is where it matters because it's a contrast to Trump when he talks, and it's a contrast to Vance when he talks. She comes across as nice, thoughtful, thinking of other people's needs. That's where she can connect, because she cannot connect on the economy. She cannot connect on the border because she is tied to a failing administration's policies. On this, she seems it's a kind of kinder, gentler Kamala who cares about you. I mean, that's what she's trying to do. I'm not buying it, but I think some voters are compared to Trump.
All right, well, can I just read on the whether she's thoughtful and thinking about stuff? This is word for word her answer on Ukraine. Bill Whitaker asked, "What does success look like in ending the war in Ukraine?" And her answer was, "There will be no success in ending that war without Ukraine and the UN Charter participating in what that success looks like." Anybody know what that means?
So I think
the UN Charter
is trying to do in the Ukraine answer is implicitly criticize Trump for saying that he can reach a peace deal, which she interprets as Trump saying, I'm going to sit across from Putin and we're going to impose a peace on Ukraine, which is again, not a fan of the way Trump talks about Ukraine, but that's not actually what Trump says. He is not saying that I and Putin will impose a peace deal on Ukraine. He's saying we can make a deal in a day to end the war in Ukraine, which is ridiculous and it's not a stupid thing to say because it seems to satisfy a lot of people that he is saying it, but it's ridiculous. But what she's saying is it's not just going to be us sitting down with Russia. Ukraine also has to be at the table. Also the UN Charter. That's where the introduction of the UN Charter, which I didn't know actually had was a thing in 3 dimensions that sits at a negotiating table.
Well, the UN Charter is like the Dalai Lama, where every generation it gets passed down to a UN.
There's
Charter.
there's like an 18-month-old
you can read the UN Charter.
UN Charter.
Yeah. But the question completely caught her off guard, and that's when she's at her absolute worst.
How can that question catch her off guard? This is
she doesn't have a talking point for it.
But it's where it gets so unnerving. Like, okay, I understand it's a new campaign. It's not that new.
We have to talk about
it's going into its 3rd month. We have to talk about Israel also.
The Israel question.
Answer. Go ahead.
And the answer.
Well, Matt mentioned that she said we're allies of the Israeli people without saying we're allies of Benjamin Netanyahu.
But the question itself, I love, is because Bill Whitaker, I don't have it in front of me, but he was saying, it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't listened to the Biden administration on various things, this and that. Your administration seems not to hold sway. Is he an ally? The whole question, the reason that question exists, because first of all, it's not true. Israel paused the war, evacuated people, dropped smaller bombs, did listen. But the administration, in their idiocy, wanted the story out that Bibi wasn't listening. That was their doing. They made
Not just then. It's now. Look at the newspapers now. Yeah. Look at Axios's newsletter this morning. The administration is increasingly concerned that Israel is not distrustful of Israel because it is not sharing enough information about its plans on Iran. Now, this comes out a day after some set of Israeli plans about Iran are leaked
to Axios,
to the New York Times and Axios both, which publishes a long story that says Israel may not have the capability to strike Iran's nuclear sites, but that America is concerned that Israel may try, even though it can't. So it might, but it might not. So where does that come from? Who's not trusting who? Who's not? Yoav Gallant is not telling Lloyd Austin about Israeli war plans that are somehow then mysteriously ending up in the pages of the New York Times. This is total projection.
They're saying, how dare you not tell us your plans so that we can leak them and thereby stop them from happening. I mean, it's a completely absurd. I just, in the final moments, though, I do want to contrast what happened last night on 60 Minutes with what has happening behind the scenes in CBS News. The Free Press had a remarkable story yesterday with audio from the CBS News morning meeting on October 7th, where Tony Dokapil, the CBS evening news reader,
morning show. The CBS.
He's on the morning show.
Yeah, he's one of the
Nora's in the
CBS
evening.
mornings.
I'm sorry. Yes, Tony's on the morning show, and last week he interviewed Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose new book is anti-Semitic screed, and Tony Dokapil, had the temerity to challenge Ta-Nehisi Coates, and the interview did not go well for Ta-Nehisi Coates. It was an embarrassment. And it exposed, I think, the idiocy and the malign intent of this book that he's published, and which is selling a lot of copies because he's Ta-Nehisi Coates. So what's the outcome of this interview? Well, on the morning call, as the Free Press reports, Tony Dokoupil was chastised for creating an unsafe environment for CBS News employees. And CBS News is going to bring in a mandatory diversity trainer to educate people about how to deal with, I'm not even sure, these hostile workplace environments.
They didn't just say the hostile workplace environment. They said that the interview did not meet CBS's
standards.
Editorial.
He accidentally did a journalism, as they say.
He actually asked a tough question to a prominent writer.
Here's what Tony Dokoupil said to Ta-Nehisi Coates. He said, "You've written this book. You portray Israel in a certain light. You do not mention October 7th. You do not mention Hamas. You do not mention terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians dating back decades. How can you write a book that claims to provide a portrait of this extraordinarily complicated matter while leaving out Israel's antagonists and their role in the battle?" And Ta-Nehisi Coates, unaccustomed to ever being questioned by anybody about anything,
or edited,
including his lousy comic books and his ridiculous assertion that is the centerpiece of his gigantic book, Between the World and Me, that the entire history of white racism can be told by the fact that he was in an elevator with his teenage son, and a white guy on the elevator looked at his teenage son, and he saw in the white guy's eyes the entire 400-year history of oppression that was now going to be passed down to his son. There was not a conversation. There was not a word spoken. There was nothing. It was a look. And this is what made his career. This is what made him a prophet. This is what made him sell 3 million copies. And this is what made this book, the publication of this book, the message, something that is a publishing event of 2024. And so guess what? Barry Weiss, right? The Barry Weiss incident happened 4 years ago, right? With Adam Rubinstein getting fired and Barry quitting and Barry starting the Free Press and all of that. And apparently ain't nobody in mainstream media learned a single lesson from this. It is the same world. This is exactly the same accusation that is being made. This is exactly the same set of prejudices that are being thrown at anyone in the news business who does not kowtow to the radical ideology of the young people in the room. And I don't know who these CBS News executives are. CBS has been playing revolving, musical chairs, and everyone's being fired, and no one is watching CBS News, and it's in a terrible crisis and all of that. And so this is how they they
need a Myrna Kagan to say there in the where are the men?
Yeah, well, there are two women. It was 2 women, by the way, who run CBS News, who were the ones who were attacking.
But you know who is Myrna Kagan in this situation is Supreme Court correspondent Jan Crawford Greenberg, who was fantastic on the audio call and said,
you can hear it. Yeah,
you can hear her say, "This is insane."
Yeah,
literally, Dokoupil is journalisming. And you're punishing him for this. Yeah. It's a travesty, and it was real revealing contrast between that and the 60 Minutes thing. But also just take a step back and think, okay, that's the culture of CBS News. They wanted this to go well for Kamala Harris. They are on her side.
Well,
and look what she did.
They wanted it to go well so much. We haven't even gotten into the editing of the interview. The
jump cuts, yeah.
And then the voiceovers.
Yes.
So
Bill Whitaker would ask her a question.
We could do a version of it. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be Kamala Harris, and then you be Bill Whitaker. Okay, so here's I'm going to start saying,
John, shouldn't Abe be Kamala? Because his impression is so good.
Okay, yeah, well, you're not going to hear Kamala is the problem.
That's a good
point.
Okay, so you can be Kamala.
In other words,
no one needs to be Kamala is the point.
We're doing what is important in the nature of how we're doing things and why.
She believes that they're doing what's important.
I don't know what
in the nature of having. And she further went on to say, blah, 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 blah. He asked the questions.
It happened 5 times.
And then answered them for her. Because God knows, if we thought what they actually showed us was bad, I would love to know what she was saying as the volume went down and the voiceovers came up.
By the way, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's like you do see, people do talk over people in interviews sometimes, but this was a very, very unusual piece of editing.
But again, we've become habituated to the jump cut, to the moments.
There was no jump cut.
No, but
there was no jump cut.
But I think the American people with this administration, because of Joe Biden's inability to speak sentences coherently one after the other, have gotten used to a kind of clipped TikTok ready sort of bit of video that says all they need to say. Right.
All right, so let's go to Commentary Recommends, and we'll do it very quickly and go. Apple TV, I mentioned last week that Apple TV had a really good movie on called The Instigators with Matt Damon and Casey Affleck, a sort of a heist crime comedy set in Boston, kind of a shaggy dog story, which I really liked. This week, today, I'm recommending Wolves, which is the other big star movie that for some reason Apple decided to release directly onto its service rather than to theaters, starring George Clooney and Brad Pitt, both of whom are playing characters out of George Clooney's movie Michael Clayton, from which you may have seen 15 or 17 years ago. The characters who show up kill Tom Wilkinson and then clean up the mess that has been made, fixers who deal with corporate difficulties, and that is who these two. So
George isn't Michael Clayton in this.
No, George is one of the fixers.
I see,
and he shows up called to deal with a crisis scene where somebody seems to have died. A male prostitute seems to have died in the company of the district attorney of New York. And he's there to clean up the scene. And as he is cleaning up the scene, the door opens and Brad Pitt walks in. And he is another fixer who is there to clean up messes like this. The two of them don't know each other. They don't understand what's going on. Why are there two of them and not one? And then things kind of proceed on in one of those, oh, wait a minute, something weird is happening. And then the corpse wakes up. And so now they have a living person in a trunk of a car, and they have to figure out what to do, how to return the illicit items that he had, and it goes on from there. And it is funny and kind of delightful, and the two of them are fantastic together, Clooney and Pitt, like they were in the Ocean's 11 movies. So that's Wolves on Apple TV. These are the two best movies I've seen really in the last couple of months, and they're both on Apple TV. And of course, Apple TV also made Coda, which won the Oscar, 2 or 3 years ago, and was the best movie of that year. So why they're not releasing them to theaters, I don't know, but they should have released this. But if not, you can go watch it any moment of the day. Wolves, George Clooney, Brad Pitt, like basically just as a comedy. They're like the Odd Couple. But they're fixers from Michael Clayton. Anyway, that is my recommendation. Wolves, Apple TV. We'll be back tomorrow. For Matt, Seth, Christine, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.